In our past video, we answered some of the most popular objections to the ontological argument. So in this video, we're going to look at objections that can appear to be more complicated, but as you will soon see, they are just as easy to refute. So let's begin. The first one I want to address is the skeptical approach of substituting God in the argument with an unsolved mathematical problem, like Goldbach's conjecture. Skeptics will say that since it's possible Goldbach's conjecture is true, then modal logic should also dictate it is actually true. But that's absurd, because we just can't prove mathematical theories are true through modal logic. So why should we conclude that modal logic can rationally show God exists? Well, the problem with this parity is that we cannot know if Goldbach's conjecture is true in a possible world, since we cannot test an infinite set of numbers to know if it is even coherent in one possible world. Whereas with the ontological properties of God, we can evaluate them and know if they would make sense in one possible world. These are two completely different subjects. To know if something is true in a possible world, we have to know everything about it to know whether it is logically coherent or not. Since we do not know everything about these unsolved mathematical problems, we cannot be in a position to know if it is true in one possible world. In other words, God can exist in a possible world because we can evaluate the properties God would have. We cannot evaluate an infinite set of numbers and know if it is true or not. So problems like Goldbach's conjecture are possible in an epistemic sense, but not in a metaphysical sense. Moving to another objection, some skeptics will argue there's a contradiction in the properties of God. Mainly that God's omniscience forms a contradiction with either his omnipotence or his moral perfection. First, the way they say God's omnipotence is in contradiction with his omniscience is if God is all-knowing, he can't change his mind, meaning there is something God can't do, therefore he can't be omnipotent. However, the problem with this is it once again assumes omnipotence means one can do anything. We've already dealt with this in a previous video, and demonstrated that omnipotence doesn't mean God can do the logically impossible. It means God is all-powerful and can do anything that is logically possible within his nature. And asking can God change his mind is the same as asking can a being that knows everything learn something new, because changing your mind is a cognitive process involving the manipulation of knowledge resulting in a different outcome. God's knowledge cannot change over time because from the very moment it exists, it is completely perfect. And the definition of omniscience entails the possession of every outcome of all possible manipulations of all possible items, instantly. Therefore, the fact that God cannot change his mind is no more a refutation of God's omnipotence than the fact that he can't learn anything new or make a square circle. Now, does God's omniscience contradict his moral perfection? Skeptics will argue if God knows everything, including the future, then he knew our entire future before it happened. Therefore, since our futures were already known, they were predestined. Therefore, God predestined evil and is the cause of evil. Therefore, God is not morally perfect. However, there are two ways to refute this. The first is to point out this results from a limited view of omniscience. God doesn't simply know the future, God knows every future. In other words, God knows every choice we will have, and every possible decision we could make, and every possible future that could result from every possible decision. But he leaves the freedom to us to decide which possibility is actualized. However, I prefer the other approach, which is that this objection results from a misunderstanding of divine omniscience. God does not predict the future from the past, but rather postdicts from the future, so to speak. God is not bound by time, so God was not sitting around one day and decided to create the universe and determine everything by already knowing what would happen. Rather, God existing outside of time actualizes all time at once. It can be said like this: the past is already known, the future is something that is unknown but has an infinite number of possibilities, and the present is the eliminator of those possibilities. God knowing the future does not determine it, as his knowledge is not a determining process from the past, but rather a knowledge that exists presently and is actualized by free will. The future for us exists as a web of possibilities, whose outcome is known by God, but not predictively from the past, but rather postdictively from the present and future. The mistake that is often made is to confuse man's understanding of his actions with the knowledge possessed by a divine being. The two are not the same, and once this is understood, this paradox is resolved. The main thing we have to remember, God being outside of time, is not bound by it the same way we are. His omniscience transcends a state of time and is not stuck in the past. So the next objection was put forward by Dr. Arif Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed argues necessity is not a great-making property, since contingent things can have great-making properties besides necessary existence, and it would be ridiculous to say something contingent, like a piece of music by Mozart, that has some great-making properties, would be better if it was necessary. However, Peter S. Williams says, this sounds an odd thing to say, because a necessarily existent piece of music couldn't also be something composed by Mozart. This thought experiment asks one to imagine a piece of music that both is and is not the product of a contingent process of composition by a specific contingent person, which is of course an incoherent notion. He goes on to note that we must remember that necessity is a great-making property for anything that could coherently have it. If it doesn't logically follow that something like a piece of music could have necessary existence, then there is no reason to assume it might be able to. All in all, this does not show that necessary existence is not a great-making property, or that this property could not be possessed by a being. So the next objection kept me thinking for a while when I first began to study the argument. Some skeptics will argue things that are logically possible, and being that they are logically possible, they contradict God's existence. They are based on Peter Van Inwagen's correct atheist argument. However, the most popular form I've seen it in goes like this. It is possible there is a non-sentient world. Since there is nothing incoherent about the concept of a non-sentient world, then it is a possible world. If a possible world is a non-sentient world, then God does not exist in that world. Therefore, God does not exist in every possible world, and therefore God is not necessary, and instead is impossible. Therefore, God is impossible. Now, the basic point of this objection is that even though the ontological argument seems logical, one could form a logical argument like this one, which also seems logical, but they both cannot be true. So which is which? So skeptics are trying to say we should not conclude something exists just because it seems logical and can't be shown to be impossible, which is something I can agree with. However, we need to clarify here that in the ontological argument, when philosophers say God is possible, they are not just saying God is possible because the concept of God is logical, and we should give the possibility of it the benefit of the doubt. God goes beyond being logically possible and is metaphysically possible because there are additional reasons to think so. Now, what does this mean? Well, just about anything can be logically possible if it contains no self-contradictions, which is pretty simple to do, whereas metaphysical possibility is generally thought to be more restrictive than just being logically possible. So fewer things are metaphysically possible than are just logically possible. Some philosophers will debate on when we can consider something metaphysically possible, but a general rule to remember is that for something to be metaphysical, there needs to be an additional reason or evidence to support it other than it just seeming logically possible. We also have to remember the ontological argument is a metaphysical argument, so we can't create an argument in metaphysics relying on something just being logically possible. Luckily, unlike this argument, which can only rely on giving something that seems logical the benefit of the doubt, God's possibility is metaphysical, because there are additional reasons to think so. For example, Peter S. Williams argues that the repeated failures of attempts to show that God is an incoherent concept justify a pessimistic inference, and some have been convinced by this. Trent Doherty says, since all efforts to show that the concept of God is contradictory have failed, heretofore I conclude, somewhat reluctantly, that God exists. Now I realize that to the average person this seems like a trick, but the average person is not particularly accustomed to following logical arguments at all, much less highly specialized forms of logical calculi developed by professional philosophers. What do those who know it but don't believe in God say? They say that the concept of God is incoherent. I have not yet seen an even slightly plausible argument to that effect. Until I do, the OA will be cogent to me. I might add that I am a convert on this argument. I argued for years that the ontological argument was flawed until someone showed me the modal version. I have always followed reason wherever it led, and as usual, it led to God. Now, as Doherty points out, if one is not accustomed to logical arguments, we can also find an inference another way. Another good reason is pointed out by J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig in Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. Dr. Craig points out that the other arguments of natural theology raise the probability of God's possibility and provide a reasonable foundation that God is possible. Now, this doesn't entirely rest the ontological argument on the other arguments. However, as he points out, the theistic arguments need not to be taken to be like links in a chain, in which one link follows another so that the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. Rather, they are like links in a coat of chainmail, in which all the links reinforce one another so that the strength of the whole exceeds that of any single link. The ontological argument might play its part in a cumulative case for theism, in which a multitude of factors simultaneously conspire to lead one to the global conclusion that God exists. In that sense, Anselm was wrong in thinking that he had discovered a single argument which, standing independent of all the rest, served to demonstrate God's existence in all his greatness. Nevertheless, his argument does encapsulate the thrust of all the arguments together to show that God, the Supreme Being, exists. The reverse ontological argument also fails for this reason. The first premise says it is possible God does not exist. Since God is not contingent, this is then synonymous with saying it is possible God is impossible, which is a logical claim, but there is no metaphysical reason to suggest this, since all attempts to argue God is impossible have failed. So there is no reason to think that it is possible God is impossible, other than it just being a logical claim, but not a metaphysical one. So any parody of the ontological argument doesn't live up to it, because all parodies rely on giving logical claims of possibility the benefit of the doubt, whereas the ontological argument doesn't have to rely on this. There are strong reasons to think God is metaphysically possible. Now the final objection I want to look at seems like a last resort attempt to debunk the argument. Skeptics will pull a quote from Alvin Plantinga to try to say that he thinks the argument doesn't work. In The Nature of Necessity, Plantinga says, "It must be conceded, however, that argument A is not a successful piece of natural theology, for the latter typically draws its premises from a stock of propositions accepted by nearly every sane man, or perhaps nearly every rational man. Hence, our verdict on these reformulated versions of St. Anselm's argument must be as follows. They cannot perhaps be said to prove or establish their conclusion." Now, as one would have guessed, this quote is out of context. Plantinga goes on to say something very important. But since it is rational to accept their central premise, they do show that it is rational to accept the conclusion, and perhaps that is all that can be expected from any such argument. Plantinga is not saying the argument is a waste of time. It actually does what it is supposed to do. The point he is making is the argument cannot and should not be used to prove God exists, like one can prove the earth is round. But as he says at the end of the quote, the argument shows that the belief in God is completely rational. The ontological argument is not a way to prove God exists. In fact, no argument in natural theology can be said to prove God exists like one proves a scientific fact. The aim of this argument and natural theology is to show that the best inference and most rational conclusion we can come to is that God exists. All Plantinga is doing here is pointing this out, and reminding us that accepting the existence of God is still a more rational conclusion than concluding God does not exist, since it can't be proven either way. So in conclusion, the argument is valid and does exactly what it is supposed to do. It shows that since God is possible, it is far more rational to accept that he exists than to accept that he doesn't exist. To deny this is to deny the most logical and rational conclusion anyone could draw.